As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Imagine that cities in the United States, once filled with the noise of tourists and bright lights, are beginning to empty. Restaurants that once struggled to accommodate everyone are now deserted. Taxis stand idle without passengers, and the streets of major tourist areas are becoming quiet and empty. This is not a scene from a movie, but the reality facing the American tourism industry. How did it happen that countries that have been major sources of tourists for decades are now canceling trips to the US en masse? And how is this affecting the economy of a country where tourism is one of the largest and most dynamic industries?
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
In recent years, the number of foreign tourists, especially from South Korea, has declined sharply. Tourists who used to fill hotels and restaurants are now avoiding America, and the reason for this is not only economic instability. In 2024, the US was expecting record tourist arrivals, but strangely, warning signs began to appear. Difficulties in obtaining visas, tighter border controls, and extremely unpleasant incidents, such as the mass deportation of workers from South Korea, have severely undermined confidence. Families who previously looked forward to vacationing in the US are now deciding to postpone their plans or choose other destinations altogether. Why take the risk of traveling to a country where safety is in question when cities like Paris, Tokyo, or Sydney offer easier visa procedures and hassle-free travel? For most tourists, the answer is obvious. But the loss of this flow is not just empty seats in restaurants. It is hundreds of millions of dollars going to other economies. It is thousands of jobs that depend on tourist flows. How does this happen, and what exactly do Americans lose when a tourist decides to choose another destination?
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Every year, millions of people from South Korea spent huge amounts of money in American casinos, shops, restaurants, and on excursions. For example, a single group from Korea could contribute up to $200,000 to the Las Vegas economy during their stay. But what happens when that money stops coming in? How do empty tables in Korean restaurants in Los Angeles or half-empty hotels in Hawaii become symbols of a global economic problem? And most importantly, is there a chance to regain the trust of tourists? Or is this already an irreversible process? Immerse yourself in a story where the US is losing billions and tourists are choosing other countries. Why does the future of American tourism depend not only on political decisions, but also on whether they can regain lost trust? In this video, we'll look at how visa barriers and ill-considered actions affect small businesses that depend on visits from foreign guests, and how this affects the lives of ordinary Americans. The American tourism industry is experiencing a crisis that would have been impossible to predict just a couple of years ago. In 2024, the industry expected record numbers of international tourists, but with each passing month, the situation is spiraling out of control. This is especially noticeable in major tourist centers such as Las Vegas, where the decline in tourism has reached alarming proportions. In the early months of summer, Las Vegas found itself on the brink of financial collapse, and local businesses began to sound the alarm. This is not just a seasonal decline. It is the result of a whole series of factors that, taken together, have led many countries, once the main sources of tourists to the US, to massively revise their plans and abandon trips to America. For many years, the US was considered one of the most popular travel destinations, especially for South Korean citizens, who until recently consistently brought in millions of tourists. These tourists did not just travel, they brought significant economic benefits. South Koreans are known for their generous spending, and according to statistics, each tourist from South Korea to the US spent an average of more than $4,000. This money flowed into the economy at every turn, in restaurants, hotels, shops, casinos, taxis, and sightseeing tours. Korean tourists spent so much money in Las Vegas that without them, the city's economy would have faced a serious decline in revenue. They were one of the most stable groups, willing to spend large amounts of money on entertainment, food, and shopping. However, in recent years, this flow has declined sharply.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
The decline in tourism in Las Vegas was not a local problem. Hotel complexes in Nevada, once filled to capacity, now stand half empty. Restaurants that used to be unable to keep up with the flow of visitors are now closing earlier than usual, and bartenders and waiters complain that their shifts have become much shorter. Taxi drivers, who used to receive constant orders from tourists, now wait for hours for customers, and this is observed not only in Las Vegas, but throughout the United States. Reports show that Las Vegas alone lost about $2 billion in the summer months of 2024, which is a catastrophic amount for a city whose economy is heavily dependent on tourism. But why did this happen? The main reason is a sharp decline in the number of tourists from South Korea, which came as a shock to the American tourism industry. This country has traditionally been one of the largest sources of foreign tourism in the US. South Koreans love to travel around America, enjoy the local culture, and visit famous tourist attractions. But every year since 2020, this flow has been decreasing. And the reason for this is not only the pandemic, which has restricted international travel, but also changes in US visa policy. After the pandemic, the US tightened visa requirements for foreign citizens, including South Koreans. Visa problems, long queues, and complicated procedures have become a real obstacle for many who want to visit America. Many people who previously did not think about visa issues are now starting to look for alternative destinations, such as Japan, Australia, or European countries, where the visa application process is much simpler. The situation is exacerbated not only by visa difficulties, but also by political and social events that have begun to influence the perception of America abroad. One such factor is the incident involving the mass deportation of Hyundai employees, which shocked many South Korean citizens. Footage of employees being put into IC vehicles and taken away from the factory spread around the world, and for many in South Korea, it became a sign that the US was no longer a safe place for their citizens. This incident caused a great deal of discontent, and many people began to question whether it was worth risking their safety to travel to the US. Families who had previously planned to spend their vacations in Miami or Hawaii began to choose more peaceful and safer destinations, such as Paris or Tokyo.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
This incident had consequences for the American economy. The loss of even a small portion of tourists from South Korea was a blow to many cities whose economies depend heavily on foreign visitors. Economists note that every Korean tourist who does not come to the US brings direct losses to local businesses. For example, by canceling a trip, a group of 100 people can deprive the Las Vegas economy of about $500,000. This amount directly affects the income of hotel, restaurant, and store employees who earn money from foreign customers. And if there are several thousand such cancellations, as has been the case in recent years, the total losses will be measured in billions of dollars. This poses a real threat to the entire tourism industry of the country. This decline in tourism is not just a decrease in the number of tourists. It is, above all, an economic blow to entire industries. The drop in visitor numbers means that hundreds of thousands of people working in tourism are losing their jobs or seeing their working hours reduced. This has direct consequences for local residents whose income depends on tourism. In Las Vegas, where each tourist can spend up to $200,000 in a few days, the loss of just a few tour groups from South Korea can lead to the closure of entire businesses. Restaurants, shops, and hotels that once thrived are now facing a harsh reality. Their revenues are falling, while their expenses remain the same.
An attack of any sort on this country is an attack on Canada as a member of the NATO alliance.
These problems are not unique to Las Vegas. Other major US tourist destinations, such as Hawaii, New York, and Los Angeles, are also seeing a decline in tourism. In Hawaii, for example, a single tour group from South Korea can fill several dozen hotels in a single weekend. Now that there are fewer such groups, hotel chains are forced to close some of their buildings or cut staff. This not only reduces profits, but also hurts the entire economy, where small businesses suffer from the decline in tourism. Thus, the decline in tourism from South Korea is not just a reduction in the flow of foreign tourists. It is the beginning of a larger problem that could affect not only Las Vegas, but the entire country. Loss of trust, growing visa barriers, and negative political events are having a devastating effect on the economy, and the consequences of this crisis could be felt for years to come.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
After the incident involving the mass deportation of Korean workers from the U.S., tourist traffic from South Korea to the country fell to a record low. At first glance, this event may have seemed like a temporary and local problem, but it sent a signal to thousands of potential tourists that America might not be safe for their citizens. Subsequently, this incident proved to be much more significant than many might have expected, and its consequences affected not only the economy but also the perception of the U.S. on the international stage. The refusal to visit reflected a profound loss of trust that was no longer limited to political debates or specific incidents. It was a trust that was slowly but surely being eroded, leaving behind long-term economic consequences. For South Korea, the situation was particularly painful. The images of Hyundai workers being deported led many South Koreans to reconsider their plans to travel to the US. The mere fact that people who were there legally could be so rudely expelled made many feel that America was no longer a country that welcomed them. These concerns were not limited to the workers affected by the deportation. They were soon followed by ordinary tourists who did not want to expose themselves to the risks and inconveniences they might encounter when traveling to the US. But this crisis of confidence was not only political. It dealt a powerful blow to tourism and the economy.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
First and foremost, the cancellation of trips meant serious losses for businesses that had previously depended on tourist traffic. This was especially true for the restaurant and hotel industries, where infrastructure costs remained unchanged, but revenues began to plummet. This was especially noticeable in areas with a high concentration of tourists from South Korea, such as Los Angeles and Hawaii. As tourist numbers declined, restaurants specializing in Korean cuisine began to complain about declining revenues. In Hawaii, one canceled group from South Korea could mean a loss of several $100,000 over the weekend, which was extremely painful for local businesses. Traditional baby restaurants, which used to be crowded until late at night, were now left with empty tables. Even in major tourist centers such as Las Vegas, hotels began to lower their prices to attract the remaining tourists, but this was not enough to cover the losses. For small businesses and local residents, the consequences were much more noticeable. When it comes to ordinary Americans who depended on tourism for their livelihoods, it's fair to say that they were the first to feel the blow. Waiters, bartenders, taxi drivers, and cleaners, whose incomes depended largely on the flow of foreign tourists, faced the real threat of losing their jobs. Strangely enough, it was not the large hotel chains that suffered the most, but rather the small family-owned businesses that could not compete with the giants and depended on a steady flow of tourists to survive. For such businesses, the drop in customer numbers was a disaster that not all of them could cope with.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Economists and tourism experts had long warned that a decline in the number of tourists from South Korea could cause a domino effect that would affect far more industries than just hotels and restaurants. But what proved more devastating than the loss of profits for individual businesses was the loss of trust that had once been the foundation for the growth of tourism in the United States. Vacation plans became dependent on many factors, but safety was certainly at the top of the list. And if, after the deportation of tourists from South Korea, America began to be perceived as an unsafe place, This was a signal to the entire tourism industry. Unfortunately, trust was lost. And this trust is important not only for maintaining the flow of tourists, but also for maintaining the country's image. It's not just about lost money. If feelings of dissatisfaction and anxiety come to the fore, it means that restoring trust will be extremely difficult. The tourism market is not just a game of numbers. It is a game of reputation, which is built up over years. Many families who previously planned to spend their summer holidays in the US are now looking for alternatives in other countries where there are no such issues with security and visa availability. And although US government reports officially state that this is only a temporary decline, for many local residents, these temporary changes are turning into a real threat to their future.
In fact, the average US tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
It is important to understand that the loss of trust is not a one-time event. Visa problems, bureaucratic complications, and alarming news, such as deportation, gradually accumulate, creating a negative image for potential tourists. And if this process continues, we can expect that tourists who decide to visit other countries, such as Japan, Australia, or Europe, will choose to stay there. All of this leads to the American economy losing billions that could have come in the form of tourist spending. For small businesses whose income depends on tourists, this is especially painful, as they can no longer make up for the loss of new customers. But the most important point remains that the resolution of a single incident has not only affected tourist flows, but has also affected the most important part of the tourist process, trust. And as the experience of many countries has shown, regaining lost trust is much more difficult than simply reducing visa fees or simplifying the visa application process. As a result, once trust is lost, it takes a very long time to rebuild. And the consequences of this loss are not only empty restaurants and hotels, but also the ruined lives of those who worked in these industries, hoping for stability.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
For businesses focused on international tourism, this downturn is a signal that such shocks can be not only financial but also long-term. Businesses must be prepared for the fact that loss of trust could become a major challenge, not only for the US, but for global tourism as a whole, where issues of safety, political stability, and accessibility are becoming the most important criteria for choice.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
After tourism in the US began to decline due to changes in visa policy and political incidents such as the mass deportation of Korean workers, economists and tourism experts began to sound the alarm. This crisis of confidence affected not only South Korea but also other countries. Looking at the growing number of travel cancellations, especially from countries such as Brazil, Mexico, and India, it becomes clear that the problem of tourism in the United States is not a local phenomenon. It is a global crisis that affects the entire market and could have long-term consequences. It is important to understand that, in addition to financial losses, the US is beginning to lose its reputation as a country that is welcoming to foreign tourists, which means that tourists will look for other places to travel to. Visa problems, long waiting times, and increased visa fees are driving foreign tourists, especially those from developing economies, to other regions. A striking example of this is the situation with Indian tourists. India is one of the countries with a growing middle class and a desire to travel abroad. Previously, they considered America one of the best countries to visit, but now, with the increase in visa fees and the rising cost of tours, many prefer other destinations such as Dubai, Singapore, or Europe. Many Indian families who used to visit the US every year have started to give it a miss. Due to long visa waiting times and the hassle of getting permits, these tourists are now heading to more accessible and friendly countries. For example, if a family from India used to spend $10,000, $12,000 on a trip to the US, now the same amount goes towards traveling in Europe, where visa processes are easier and services are more diverse and cheaper. This change in tourist behavior has had serious financial consequences for many cities. Hawaii, New York, and Los Angeles, these megacities, which traditionally attracted tens of thousands of foreign tourists every year, have seen a sharp drop in the number of visitors. In Hawaii, which welcomes hundreds of Korean tourists every year, the number of cancelled trips has already led to the closure of several small hotels. In some areas of Los Angeles, dozens of restaurants and shops catering to foreign customers have begun to reduce their staff or close their doors earlier than usual. Economists say that losing even 5 to 10% of tourists is not just a financial loss, but the beginning of a long-term economic downturn for small businesses that depend on tourism. Restaurants and hotels that relied on customers from South Korea, India, and Mexico are now facing a drop in revenue, and their owners are forced to look for ways to survive.